What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. To me, it's pretty clear that we have to start with the ramp list, and this is the exact list that won my KMBest Holiday Block Party tournament. The winner, of course, got it from my video where I suggested it as the list to win my KMBest Holiday Block Party tournament with. This is an extremely potent list that has so much going for it in terms of its own output and its interactive tools. As other tech decks have become more focused on cheaper cards like Shadow King and Deafening Chord, this deck remains the only one that can reasonably afford a proactive points-based game plan while still including cards like Enchantress and Cosmic Ghost Rider. There simply are not other decks that are able to do it. It occupies almost an RSM-esque spot in the format where it has these extremely powerful top-end tech cards that are at the top end of impact for what tech cards are because of their cost, and also a very powerful ability to put about 35 points in one lane and then have a final turn that involves 27 points going somewhere else, which means that it is a deck that is extremely able to do what Marvel Snap is about: win two locations. That is largely the strength of the deck. This is not a deck that attacks three locations particularly well. Most decks that are built to attack three locations do it better than this, but the strength of this deck is that in 4 spots on the location, it is probably going to have more and bigger stuff than you. Using those 4 spots efficiently is the biggest thing this deck does well, and that's the real secret power of a ramp deck in Marvel Snap. The cards they play are bigger than the cards you play, and in a world where you're really only competing over 2 locations, that is a big advantage for them. They have the biggest 6-drop, they have the biggest 1-drop, they have the next biggest 6-drop. They have all of these extremely space-efficient cards, and that, plus their tech, is the biggest thing that this deck has going for it. A lot of other decks are probably better than this deck at attacking 3 locations, but you don't need to do that to win 2 of them. You can just win 2 of them. Some form of wolf pile has pretty clearly emerged as the sort of, I would say, likely deck to beat of this format, and it's weird because this deck is good, but it's not special. Like, it's just a very fine thing to do. This is a zombie-less zombies list, effectively, because Shadow King and Deafening Chord are so defining in the format, and it's quite difficult to be a Shadow King deck if you're a zombie deck. You kind of can't play the zombie package here, but that is fundamentally what's going on. The baseline here is Werewolf Merlin and Shadow King and Deafening Chord, and then the rest of it just sort of is cards that go with that. And then you really want like a secondary point thing, which is not vulnerable to Shadow King, and there are surprisingly few of those. Like, you don't necessarily need to be playing like Sentry and Annihilus here. You can just play like, I don't know, Cull Obsidian and a Claw. Like, that's really what's going on at this top end here. It's not pretty. Like, there is just a lot of very mediocre top end in the game right now, and that's why this deck is while I do think it is one of the best decks in the game, I also think it's one of those things that can really sincerely improve with the addition of better 5-drops, and it is worth noting that the Season Pass card for January looks like it is an extremely powerful 5-cost card that scales with you playing multiple cards per turn, which is kind of exactly what this deck ordered. Inasmuch as Tech Pile is an archetype, this is what Tech Pile looks like right now. It is, give or take, the Tech Pile deck of this format, and it's really just wolf mid-range with some things at the top end. I think people think of this as an Annihilus deck. They shouldn't. The Annihilus package is pretty clearly the worst group of cards in the deck. It's just also there aren't a lot of, like, competitors for it, where, like, you know, for a Quake spot, there's a lot of utility 2-drops you could play, right? For Annihilus, there's just not really, like, a good 4 or 5 top end that really makes sense other than that in there. And so it's really just sort of in there by default rather than in there because it's amazing. And again, it would be a zombie package if Shadow King wasn't the monster that he is right now. I think Maverick has somehow become an underrated card. Like, yeah, okay, Maverick is not great in a world where the number 1 card you see is Shadow King, the number 2 card you see is Deafening Chord, and the deck I think is probably the best deck in the game is also playing Cosmic Ghost Rider. I understand all of that. The problem is this card is really jacked up. This card is really, 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 really strong, and I think that that is going to be the truth of this card more than anything else. Like, I just fundamentally believe that what this card is doing is a powerful thing in a powerful package. Depending on how you want to build it, you can build it however you want. This is not the build that got second place in my KMBest Holiday Block Party, but it is a fairly similar in concept build, because what Maverick does incredibly well is shift between the ability to go very tall and the ability to go very wide, copying broods, of course, or buffing broods, I should say. That is the main function of this card. It lets you do incredibly powerful things for not a lot of energy. And then you also have this Jocasta stuff, which I would argue is, I don't think it's necessarily the biggest part of what Maverick is doing, but it is a nice little multiplier to have. I think largely the biggest argument against the Jocasta stuff is, as already discussed, a lot of Deafening Chord, some amount of Cosmic Ghost Rider. You don't want to necessarily open yourself up to that. But I do think that this deck, or some form of Maverick deck similar to it, is just an extremely powerful thing to be doing right now, despite the fact that the metagame is quite hostile to it. It's also, I guess, time to talk about Aurora, whose biggest sin is that she is not Merlin Werewolf. When you're making a mid-range deck right now, you really sort of have to look and say, all right, well, I'm making a mid-range deck. I want to be playing, Shadow King Deafening Chord, and Aurora's not really that good at playing Shadow King Deafening Chord, so you lose out on that. And then you compare her on points to Merlin Werewolf, and it's like, maybe she's better, maybe she's not. This is, so far, my favorite Aurora list, which should be a surprise to nobody because I'm a massive Wiccan coper, but she does a lot here. She's good. She does good stuff. There's good power output here between Stardust and Thing First Steps, and you do have a Shadow King, and you have a lot of ways to interact. There's cool stuff happening here. I don't want to sit here and act like this is, impossibly bad or anything like that. It's fine. It's just that Aurora's biggest issue is her competition, and her competition is really strong. I think she's actually quite a good card, which is why this deck is so high up on the tier list. This is a good deck doing good deck stuff. But it is still fundamentally a little bit of a reactive mishmash of cards that is really only going to be able to do so much if it isn't actually ramping the way it wants. One of the things that I've noticed across multiple Aurora decks, whether they be the Luke Cage Anti-Venom builds or this one with Wiccan, is that they really care deeply about not just point output, but output of cards onto the board. And this deck has some amount of doing that, but a lot of its getting cards on the board is going to be dependent on actually having the Wiccan happen. It's a powerful enough deck, and Aurora is able to make Wiccan into a relatively viable thing, but I'm not overly 100% sure that this is going to stick around past this amount of time. Largely, that is because of the potential competition in the same space that it has from the Wolf Merlin mid-range decks. It should come as no surprise to anybody that my preferred version of the Nimrod list does not involve the card Magic. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about Merlin. The ramp decks have Legion. I'm just not interested in doing that stuff at all. This is, of course, a deck that instead of playing Magic is playing Maverick, and a turn 6 Nimrod deck is basically just trying to be the Hela of the format. Oh, cool thing you're doing over there. Too bad I've got a 9-power Nimrod off of my Maverick. Maybe it's a 12-power Nimrod because my Maverick got agonied. Oh, and then I'm blowing it up and reviving it with Adamantium Infusion. And it's like, is that the maximal Nimrod? No, the maximal Nimrod probably takes until turn 7, but I just need to be big enough to beat, not necessarily mediocre point output, but there is kind of a lot of, capped point output right now. There is a lot of okay, I mean, you've got one guy that's really big, it's a werewolf that's bouncing around, and then the rest of your lanes aren't really all that threatening. This is a deck that does a lot of point output, or enough point output is probably the way to phrase it. The way combo decks line up into metagames is they just have to be bigger than most of what people are playing. And this is bigger than most Aurora decks. It's bigger than most of the decks that people are going to be doing with Werewolf Merlin. It's just going to be a little bit bigger than most of the things people are playing. And that's really all a combo deck has to be. It doesn't have to be the biggest numbers possible. It just has to be bigger than what you play against, right? If you are playing against a deck that is doing 50 points a game and you are doing 75 points a game, that's good. You don't need to be doing 100. You don't need to be building to do 100. This is fine. I think V-Hand is a balanced and fair and still pretty freaking good deck. Victoria Hand, just a powerful thing to be doing in a general sense. There is a lot less of an ability to just like limp into games with this deck. It is a little bit more dependent on like, all right, well, I have the actual cards that matter. I'm in a Shadow King matchup. I have the Shadow King. I'm in a matchup where I need to stack points. I have V-Hand Frigga. But you can still do all of that stuff. Now, the problems this deck has with board space are notable, especially against the ramp deck. Like, it is... When you talk about this deck and you talk about ramp deck, in terms of board space efficiency, the ramp deck is so far ahead of you because it's just going to have more power per board space than you will ever be able to match, which means that if they play it smart, it's a very, very tough matchup for you. You are very liable to just be like fully stacked in one location and then have to guess where 27 power on the final turn goes, and you are just not in a good spot if they actually put you in that spot. There's a lot to be said about board space efficiency, and I think a lot to be learned from comparing and contrasting these two decks. V-Hand, not particularly board space efficient, but extremely good at attacking all three locations. Ramp, extremely board space efficient, not good at all at attacking all three locations because the price of board space efficiency is playing like one card a turn and having it be pretty big. This is largely one of the reasons why V-Hand has fallen behind a couple of the other mid-rangey decks that are able to be slightly more board space efficient. As a way of discussing this, think about, for example, a gigantic Werewolf by Night against a ramp deck. That guy at 17 power is actually able to go toe-to-toe with any of their big drops. It's a really powerful thing to have access to. That's really the gap between these two decks right now, is that V-Hand doesn't have one really big guy, and that puts a ton of stress on you as the pilot to recognize very early what your end game is going to look like and how you're going to beat their end game in those matchups. The Iris Pile deck has honestly almost fully moved into being a move deck. Oh my god. Morphed is the word I was looking for. It has almost fully morphed into being a move deck. That is a very reasonable space for a deck to be in, like being the move deck of the metagame. And I don't mean that necessarily by being like a Human Torch deck or anything. It's just, you know how Move had like these end games of Juggernaut Cosmo and was doing cool stuff in that space? That's really what this deck is doing. Just redistributing points, getting enough points out of what it's doing, stopping your interaction from doing anything. Juggernaut's actually quite a reasonable card against like decks like Ramp that aren't really filling up the board, and you can just pretty much guarantee that it says, oh, you're ahead on this lane, you're going to at least have a 50-50 based on where the thing I'm hitting lands. A lot of really powerful stuff that this deck has access to. Weirdly, the card I'm the least sold on here is Cosmo, but it is unfortunately just kind of required. A, it covers you against all sorts of random BS matchups. Having a movable Cosmo off of Madam Web is really powerful. And B, there's just a lot of Shadow King Deafening Chord, and having a card that's like, actually none of that works is also pretty powerful. So that's really the ethos here, but really this deck is giving up like actually being a Shadow King Deafening Chord deck by having so much green power in it and that kind of thing. So there are trade-offs here, right? We talked last week about how decks were either SK-DK decks, or DC, I should say, or they were decks that were doing Juggernaut Cosmo. And I think that dichotomy is still pretty true when it comes to how mid-range decks are set up. Which I guess leads us to the other Juggernaut Cosmo decks. Here, of course, is Ongoing as a Juggernaut Cosmo deck. This one, you'll notice, still does include Superior Spider-Man. I've been pretty impressed with him here. Iris ended up cutting him from that version of the list. I think it's a reasonable decision. I just think the card is so great when you're doing Juggernaut Cosmo stuff, and it's especially so great in the Ongoing list, which is very hard up for versions of this effect that will allow you to play extra cards. Just getting all of the cards in your hand onto the board is really the goal with the Ongoing list, because you can put them together in ways that are extremely overpowered and extremely dangerous. There are some issues with this list. Like, obviously, we've talked about Deafening Chord. We talked about the Enchantress and Ghost Rider coming out of the Ramp deck, but this is still just a powerful list that has powerful, I guess what you'd say is anti-interaction tools like Cosmo and Juggernaut to prevent that stuff from meaningfully impacting your scaling. And your scaling is genuinely multiplicative. Like, you have actual multiple ways to have multiplicative scalars in this deck. The power output is there. It's just sometimes you clunk, right? Like, there are going to be games where you don't draw a 2-drop and you only start playing the game on turn 3, and those games are almost all unwinnable. Like, they're not literally unwinnable, but they are really bad for you. And there's not really a lot you can do about that happening. It's just a thing that will happen to you rather than anything you have control over. Evo, of course, also a Jug Cosmo deck. Now, this is a list where Cosmo feels really iffy. Like, I am very in and out on like a couple of the choices here. Cosmo and Shang-Chi are extremely iffy to me. Like, one of them should probably be a Cyclops, I sort of feel like. The Shang-Chi is pretty exclusively there to scam ramp decks. Like, that's it. Ramp decks just don't play around that card. And so, like, especially if you're playing an Evo deck, you have similar point output to them, but you just get to blow up the Infinaut they play on turn 5 because they don't play afraid of Shang-Chi anymore. And so you just win the game. Like, that's basically the premise of the Shang. I don't know if that's enough to justify its inclusion over something that's a little more generically applicable, like a Cyclops, things of that nature. It's an interesting question. What I do like about this deck is how well put together it is to use Superior Spider-Man, who I'm pretty sure I called Symbiote Spider-Man earlier because, of course, I did. This is getting triggers off of Agony, off of Misty Knight, off of Sunspot, off of Herbie occasionally. It is just going to be on if you have any of your cards that consist of your early game. Like, it just will happen. And that allows this deck to have a ton of output. This is a deck that has, I think, maybe some rough edges to sand off, but I do like a lot of what it's actually doing. Cerebro 3 is a really good way to dodge some of the most impactful tech cards in the metagame. These tech cards, of course, are cards that are like Cosmic Ghost Rider, cards like Enchantress, cards like you have Deafening Chord, Shadow King. All of these cards can be dealt with by not being vulnerable to them in the case of Shadow King, or Cosmo in the case of every other one of them. This is a powerful list that really does get held back mostly by bad location variants, which is an interesting dynamic, I think. If you ask me from a game design perspective, is it a good thing that a deck like this exists whose biggest counter is just things nobody has any control over? I would largely say no. I think it's probably a very bad thing that the balancing mechanism for this is that there are just sometimes you'll have two locations that prevent you from actually playing the game. I will say this, though. I think a large part of that is due to how powerful and resilient this deck is. So my issue is largely that I think this deck is too good, such that the only things that really beat it are things that are out of people's control. I think this is a very powerful deck. I think people are very, very low on Cerebro 3, and frankly, I don't think they should be. I think it is an extremely underrated and extremely powerful list. Mr. Negative is just a weird deck. This is another deck that it's got the Shang-Chi thing going on here because, like having the ability to be like, I've played a null on turn 5 against you, ramp deck, and then I've blown up your Infinaut on the final turn of the game to give my null 20 power. Like, there's stuff you can do there, right? Like, oh, I've got a Ravonna out, so I played a null, and then my turn 6 is mystiquing the null with a Shang-Chi. Ooh, I didn't even need to play Mr. Negative to win this game. Like, that kind of stuff does happen. Like, it's not nothing. And I think that this deck is, you know how we talked about how like a combo deck doesn't need to have 10 million points. It just needs to have enough to win, right? I think Mr. Negative is sort of one of those decks that falls into the I must have 10 million points trap. And it's like, yeah, I can't argue that when you do what you want to do, you have 10 million points. I just think that if you think of it from a cold, detached, logical perspective, you don't need 10 million points. What we need is a consistent way to get more points than all the mid-range decks. And I think a deck like Nimrod probably does that a little bit better. You don't need to be doing all this to get the same results. The numbers on the board might look a little more impressive, but the W is going to be the same regardless. And if anything, I think the cube equity of a Magic deck is actually kind of in the gutter right now, to be completely honest with you. And I'm not sure you can play Mr. Negative without being that. It's a little bit of an iffy value prop for me. Part of why I have such a soft spot for the zombie PF type lists, because I know they're like these fragile combo-y BS things. I know that, right? But like, I just don't really think you can be a Magic deck right now and have a straight face and look at me and be like, yeah, this is going to work. Like, I just think the two decks that I think I have the most respect for in the entire game are a deck with Legion and a deck with Merlin. I just think you can't tell me that it's the right time to be doing this Magic stuff. So I have just a ton of respect for all these decks that are like, I am not going to be a Magic deck. I'm going to find some other way to get to that 7. Instead of being a Magic deck, I'm going to be a Superior Spider-Man deck. Instead of being a Magic deck, I'm going to be a Maverick deck, right? Like, that's what Nimrod is doing. I have way more respect for that kind of stuff right now than I do for, like, doing Magic things. And I think that that is a big part of why I have such respect for this deck, because it is worse than it was, right? Like, we talk about Shadow King Deafening Chord. The Kid Omega Zombie deck is definitely vulnerable to Shadow King Deafening Chord. Like, that's very real. But I do think that this is still a list that people don't understand. They don't know how to play against it. They will play incorrectly, and they will misunderstand what your power output is. And your power output is big. This is a deck that does a lot of damage. People are playing a ton of this list. To me, it reads as a, like, fairly medium list, kind of a butt style list where if you're not him, you're probably going to have like a 45% win rate on it. Like, this is a deck where I look at it and I'm like, I can see why this deck is scary, but you better be on point with your snaps. This deck is entirely just things that are terrifying. And if those things don't necessarily happen, well, you kind of lose. Now, I will say that Galactus is a much more reasonable card than I think people give him credit for, which is to say Galactus is a card that is good against board-based combo, and we do have a decent amount of that. Galactus is a card that can be quite good against Cerebro, for example. Galactus is a card that can be quite good against a lot of things. If you need to go over the top of a ramp deck, I mean, a Man Spider and a Taskmaster will do that, especially with an Agony. Like, you will be able to make that happen. But there's just kind of several question marks here. Like, the Man Spider line into blowing up your Man Spider thing and reviving it with Adamantium Infusion, that's cool. Like, you will be able to do stuff, but it's also, like, very obvious that that is what your turns are going to be. And so they'll just be like, oh, well, I'll just beat the lane you fastball special in. It's like, oh, okay, well, my bad. And I think if you've watched this video all the way through, you've already seen every rant I've made about Magic. All those rants apply here. I hate being a Magic deck. This feels like a deck that is doing fundamentally decent things, but not what I want to be doing right now. You know what time it is. It's time for Destroy at the end of the tier list. This deck is exactly what it has always been, the bar for being a reasonable deck. I'd argue it's actually probably a little bit better than the deck we just talked about. Like, maybe Destroy deserves to be a spot up in this case, but I think this is just a very fundamentally sound deck that is, as always, held back by access to its own power. It needs certain draws in order to do the powerful things, but I don't think people should sleep on this deck. I think it is a very fine, very playable, very powerful deck that is fundamentally able to do things that are of a metagame level of power. This is the bar you have to cross if you want to be considered a meta deck. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I forgot to remind you to like and subscribe, so please do that.